So, Andrea, I was wondering, now you're at this point, we're in the exhibition, it's the end of the first stage of the end of the process of making and presenting it to the public. How do you feel about how the exhibition does present to the public at this stage?
I think what the exhibition does for me is it brings something together. I mean, there's the work in the studio, but it's not just in the studio, it's also the work between making works, and then some paintings take longer. Like I might, for example, have worked on a painting like one of the painting there that has quite a big dark area in the middle, and then I will work at it later on, even sometimes a year later. Bringing this work together in an exhibition for me is like another creation, if you want. It's a creative process, and it's also sitting in the space, and I have been sitting here for quite some time. So I'm learning, by looking at the work, I'm learning what the work can do and how individual pieces, they work for themselves, but how they also engage with other pieces. And like for example, also with some of these works, I realize how sometimes there are links because of the color, sometimes there are links with the videos, how for example, you might have movement or a kind of structure, but an undulating structure that can be found also in some of the video pieces, like the piece by Rotella, where we have views of a landscape and these kind of almost these rolling hills. But then also there's something quite particular how the work sits within an architecture as well. And I think an important aspect within the painting for me is that these paintings are not so much images that you look into, but they're images that, or they're colors and forms that sort of expand beyond the space of the canvas into the exhibition space.
That's really interesting, because I found Formal Situations, which is from 2003 at the Tate, and the author of this, the curator, who was Paul Morehouse, talks about exactly what you just said in relation to the idea that here we have it, that traditional easel painting creates an illusionary, recessive space in which the viewer looks as if standing outside the world contained within the picture. Whereas abstract works, which are non-pictorial, or larger scale works, draw the spectator to the work. And that was interesting that you commented on that, because that was actually commented back in 2003 when they were conducting a survey of British abstraction from 1960 to 1970. And he also talks about a very significant show at the Tate from 1959, which was new American abstract expressionism, which is a bit of a landmark show in the UK. So, just going back to the curation of this exhibition, you have undoubtedly had many hangings of this before you got the right one, haven't you?
Well, it was really, I was glad to have had a time. I mean, this was sort of, it was thinking about the space. I knew the space beforehand. I made sketches, I made plans, I selected works. There was a lot of preparation in my mind for it. There was also a selection of the video works. But then there was also something where I knew I had to see the space and I had to actually respond and see what happens in the space. One thing that was very important at some stage was that I realized that initially as I had arranged things, that was rather tame, I found. At some point I made a conscious decision to really work with the space, to also use a bit the height of the space. to not just have a horizontal hanging, but I mean there's a video piece that is on the floor, there are some pieces that are higher. It's to almost to use the artworks to also measure the architecture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah.
And also to work with the space in between the works that is as important as the works themselves. So it's between visuals, it's also between different mediums, it's between painting and photography and video, but it's also between abstraction and then some images that refer to landscape or to cloth, or then also that notion of the sound that comes in, the sound that is a marker, like color can be a marker.
Yeah. So because the show contains painting, photography and digital media, could you just say something about your intentions for each of the different art practices that you've included in the exhibition?
I mean, I have actually worked with various media for quite some time, and I'm generally very interested to see how I might look at a painting differently because I see a photograph next to it. It's almost as if, you know, like it's a little bit like I'm, you know, like you can hear I have an accent, I'm German, so when I'm outside of Germany, I become more German. So it's that kind of sense of when you see something in juxtaposition. So that comes into it, but this body of work, I call it color folds and other things. It's the idea of folding, of continuity of movement. That obviously is within the paintings, but it's also, I mean, in the video work has, for example, it's looped, but it's also, I mean, there's one piece that has actually the bird flight, the rondoni, so it's really that sense of folding through the flight, but also how, you know, like birds, they are in the air and then they just touch down and go up again, so it brings in a three-dimensionality, and in that sense of folding. And in some, so going back to your question, the different methods work with the idea of movement or folding in different ways. Now the photography, I mean, I have photography that is in relation to a specific body of work, which is the imaginary landscapes, which talks about the folding of cloth to actually create an illusion of a landscape. Whereas some of the other photographs in here, they actually don't so much have that folding as such, but they have, I mean, even like this here, they still bring in a close-up of something, and it's an idea of, again, color and light. The folding there is more between the photograph and the painting.
So in an earlier conversation that we had this week, you talked about how the gestures of drawing form part of the process of painting. And you mentioned the gestures of bird flight then for a moment. And I just wondered, again, that seems to be an important part of your making process and your drafting process.
Thanks for bringing that up. Yes, I mean, the paintings are very much, it's not that I work from small sketches or something. They are more that I will actually take a piece of charcoal and then I will stand in front of the canvas, which I place on the wall, not on the easel, and I will actually make like a dance movement with the charcoal, and it's almost like I'm dancing, and then like the bird sort of catches the water, and so in the same way I catch the canvas with my with the charcoal, and sort of it suggests again that the lines continue outside of the canvas.
So those kind of gestural marks form the basis for the formal elements of composition.
Yes.
Which are established by those gestures. And I just wonder, as a painter also, the intersections that you can see within the paintings of shifting contour lines, how layered, or are they not layered? What's the level of interchange between the gestures in terms of, you know, when they intersect?
Are you talking about layers of paint, or are you talking the relationship between the painting and the drawing?
The relationship with drawing and the painting.
Some of the paintings, they stay very close to the initial drawing. some of the paintings become simplified. Sometimes, I mean, then obviously there is a moment where I enter then the space of the painting. And where, you know, as much as it started with a kind of dance movement, then there's the reality of the canvas and also of having that kind of spatiality where I might get rid of some of the lines or might simplify some of them. I might sometimes, you know, like also when there are parts of the color, I might actually again, you know, like decide on the amount of colors that I use, and that brings in that sense of music as well, harmonies. I mean, some of the paintings might have 3 colors, some might have 5 or 7. I don't decide this beforehand, but it's quite often at some point I think about it.
So in some ways there could be a link to Cubism here because of the idea about some sense of simultaneous representation.
That's interesting.
Which you also see in the modelling of Egyptian figures when they are viewed at multiple viewpoints. Because of the arcs, it does have that sort of quality in that.
That's very interesting. I mean, in Cubism, I find Cubism very interesting from a conceptual point of view. Exactly that they very much thought of movement. Yeah. That whole notion of movement, and that it's not just about the flatness, but that there is this simultaneity.
Yeah, most definitely, I think so. Yeah. And where is the colour sourced from, or is it not sourced from anywhere?
The colours are very much. I mean, I see them very much as abstractions, and I don't choose the colours because I like them. I use colours for their spatial quality. Right. They're spatial and luminous and luminosity. So there are bodies of work, like in the exhibition there are some smaller paintings, they all have some orange in there. That was probably a mood at the time, but then it was also to see how that orange can be measured. And you know, like the amount of orange and the, you know, like, and how it can be restricted or be opened up. I don't know if I've answered this.
I think so, yeah. And I was also going to just mention that because abstraction is understood in many different ways, you know, the interpretation of it. You know, one way would be that there is no literal representation present in the composition. But then that's difficult because geometric shapes are identifiable as squares, circles or rectangles. So do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but I don't really use geometric shapes as such. Yeah. And I don't, you know, like I think there is somebody that it works very differently, but I have had tutors when I was a student, you know, like who were part of the support surface group, support surface, you know, the French group, where and somebody like Claude Veyala who said, I don't want to use a geometric form, I don't want to use a form that depicts something. That's why he used these kind of bean-like shapes that were neither nor. And I wouldn't say this, but I would say the forms are very much there to indicate space.
Right. Yeah.
But not to depict.
Yeah. And in some ways, people like Gillian Ayres, who have always used mark making as their language for abstraction. This has got, in some ways, has got a greater sense of design about it, the compositions.
Well, there is a hard edge context, but I mean, it's also the people that I admire, somebody like Ellsworth Kelly, who's obviously very much reduced things, but he starts some of his work from shadows, you know, like he has taken photographs of shadows on a staircase, and that's then what he transcribes into abstraction. So very often some of the works that seem very abstract are still inspired by what he might have seen. And similarly, you know, like, I mean, even if, you know, like some of those curves, they are not hills, but they deal with that notion of movement and also mathematics, really, you know, like, and curves and how curves change.
Because there is a great sense of design about these compositions, well, I think so. Does that you know, if they were used for design purposes, would that be something that you would feel happy about?
That's interesting. I mean, I think that there is a relation with design insofar as there is a clarity of language and there is a kind of reduction. And we talked about the Bauhaus before. I still think they are works in their own right. You know, like I don't see them as multiples, for example. But I think there are ideas in there. For example, the idea, there are some paintings where I thought of having an obstacle in the middle. So a visual obstacle where a form would be in the middle. So some of those things, I can see them being used or being played with in design.
Can we just go back to the digital pieces? And I don't want to ask you the same question again, but could you just clarify the intentions in the three digital pieces in terms of the distinction between the three?
Between the individual pieces?
Yes.
Very often when I do video pieces, I have some footage that I might have taken, you know, a bit like a photographer who walks around with a camera and you just take photographs and you might do something with them later. Similar to the, but sometimes I also have quite a precise idea, like for example with Rotella, I happened to be in that place where you know, like I was on an elevated position and I could oversee a valley and really 360 degrees. And so I wanted to work with that. Initially I just had footage that moved, which was slightly unstable footage, but then I decided that would be too straightforward and perhaps not very interesting. So the idea of actually using fixed images came into that. But the video pieces, they are very complex, and I often write about them, and I write about them at different times, and I need to think about them. And the editing is very important there. So the editing is like what one does with painting, where one changes the color or one changes the form. So I would play with the timing, or there are some where I use a still, or sometimes the still changes into black and white. There is also the notion of, you know, sometimes having stills and moving images. So I see them actually in a way also very much related to music. You know? I see them as compositions.
Compositions rather than as paintings.
I see them as compositions, but then a painting is a composition as well. And as you can see, you know, in some of the paintings, they could be like a small piece. If you think of certain colors, there could be certain instruments, or it could be, you know, a certain beat.
I mean, as you're a researcher, an academic, and a practitioner, and an educator, then, you know, making that clear to students about the difference between picture making and the use of composition is quite an important moment in someone's art education to move beyond. And clearly your practice does offer that to students.
I think there is also something, you know, like the kind of, I sometimes say to students, you know, some students say when they're unsure about, and they say, oh, abstraction, I don't know, you know, like if this is, if I can justify doing this. And I said, well, there is a family out there. There are so many abstract art from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, and I think one has some artists that one feels affinities with, like I mentioned Elspeth Kelly, or others, and where there is also, I think, process is very important. Process not just as a material process, but conceptual process.